Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Microsoft Flight Simulator, and in today's episode we are revisiting the A320 tutorial guide, and as there's been some pretty significant changes to it, so stick around. If you are interested in acquiring any of my Overkill's tutorial guides for Microsoft Flight Simulator, please consider joining me on Patreon. Patreon subscribers level tier 2 and above have access to all of my guides, as well as any future updates and future guides that will be coming down the road. Link to Patreon can be found in the description below. Okay, so one of the main points to this was that the startup process that I had before was great for simulation and the gamer aspect. But I wanted to dive further into it, and I understand, as the more I learned, pilots go through flows. It's sort of a process of going up and down the controls until they get everything dialed in and set up. Now, normally there's two people doing this, so I'll try to call out certain points where, for example, when at the point where the external inspection would take place by whoever wasn't programming the computer. So let's just go ahead and start out how I do. So the biggest thing is, first thing, we're going to step on down to the EFB. And reason for that is a couple things. We want to get our fuel set up in the aircraft and display our flight plan information. So in the document, it does walk through how to set up your SimBrief account if you have a SimBrief account. We're just going to load my last flight. You can see that I've been testing quite a bit. We also have our MEDAR information here. Now, if you do decide to purchase the guide and decide to go through it, I don't recommend using live weather. For the first time, configure the weather based on what the guide information is. So if the altimeter is different from this, set the weather up here to whatever the altimeter setting is in the guide, which is right here. Okay. Anyway, so as a matter of fact, we'll do that right now. So live weather, according to SimBrief here, or the Flybywire pad here, is 29er. So we'll go ahead and set that. And there are a few clouds outside. So, all right. So one of the great parts about the Flybywire FlyPad, obviously, is the fact that once you program your SimBrief connection, you have access to the OFP right here. So that makes it really handy. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to fuel the aircraft. And I have this as the very first thing that we do after creating the flight plan, basically once you step into the cockpit, just because it's sort of, there are quite a few steps that back up after that, right? So what we're going to be looking for is I have my fuel set to pounds, or my OFP set to pounds. And we're going to be looking here. This is 13.9 thousand pounds of fuel. We're going to put the exact number in here, though. 13,910. And I have everything set to instant, so boom, the aircraft's just going to be fueled. I hate waiting. I really do. All right, so now let's go ahead and start walking through this process here. So first we need to do a cockpit safety check, essentially, is we're going to walk through. We're going to make sure both engine master switches are set to the off position. The engine master mode is set to norm. The parking brake is on. We want to make sure the landing gear handle is down. We're going to step into the overhead panel. We're going to make sure both windshield wipers are off. That's pilot and first officer side. We're going to make sure batteries 1 and 2 are off and that we have above 25.5 volts. That is required, the required minimum power in order to use them. And then we can turn battery 1 on and battery 2 on. All right, and external power is available, so we're going to go ahead and obviously turn that on. Holy crap, that was loud. From here, we're going to perform our Apu Fire Test. Just going to click here. It'll open the cover, and then click the same spot again. Now, when that happens, as you're holding this, I recommend binding the ECAM pages, because you can step down, and you can see there the Apu Fire information down there on the upper ECAM. Then when you let go of the button, it should clear. All right. And we're going to step back upstairs. Oh, come on. Step back upstairs. Close that cover down, and at this point now we're going to turn the master switch for the APU on, wait approximately 3 seconds, and then depress the start button. That'll get the APU rolling. Now as the APU comes to life, we We come back to that upper ECAM. Oh, nope, it's on the lower ECAM. Excuse me. There we go. You have all the APU information. You can see the end percent. So basically, the motor starting to, or the turbine starting to turn for the APU, as well as exhaust temperature rising. Flap open indicates that basically air is being sucked in to the APU, allowing it to power. And now, according to the real world information, about 90-95% we should see an availability light here, but I found with the fly-by-wire, it's almost always at 100%. We'll see an available light pop up here, indicating the APU is ready. We'll also see an available light come up on here. So we'll just come on downstairs for a minute and monitor that. Almost there. There's the 95, 98. There you go, APU Gen now and available. And then what will happen is this should, in a minute, switch back to the previous page. I believe the doors page is where we should go automatically. But there's our available light. And you don't have to do anything. It just lets you know the APU is ready and being supported. And there we go. Takes us back to the door page. All right. Now from this point here, we're also going to set the lights in the cockpit. So we have pilot PFD, primary flight display, pilot navigation display. There we go. Let's zoom back in. I didn't mean to go so far out. Lower ECAM, upper ECAM, first officer, flight and nav display, backlighting on the FCU screens if you wish, integral lights if you wish, or integrated lights, excuse me. Floodlights, those are going to be above our heads. And then finally, they also recommend turning the dome light on to at least dim until after takeoff, as in the event of an electrical loss, that will be the only light illuminating the cockpit. All right, let's move on down. So next we're going to do a brake check. All right, so things we're going to be watching for the brake check. We come back here. Is we're going to be watching the accumulator gauge here. This is the accumulator. So this is how much pressure can be delivered to the braking system. Okay, and then obviously you have your left and right brakes. So what we're going to do for this test here is we are going to come all the way back once again, and we are going to turn the parking brake off. Trying to find the best camera. I should have made a camera just for this little guy, I'm telling you. Now you can see that now that we've released the parking brakes, the brake pressure that has been applied to the pads is now gone. However, if you apply both of your brake pedals, you can see the pressure needs to be between 2,000 and 2,700 pounds per square inch on each brake set. Now, every time we let go, you should slowly see that pressure needle start to fall. And eventually what will happen is you will not notice that the pressure is now gone. If you find yourself needing to do a test, you get into an aircraft and the pressure doesn't work, what we can do is we can step back upstairs, find the yellow electrical panel here, and turn the electrical pump on. That will supply pressure to the accumulator. We can step back down here, and you can see the accumulator pressure is rising. And once it gets to the green, we can then fall back, reset the parking brake, because if you don't have any pressure in the accumulator, the parking brake's not going to do anything. It's not going to actually clamp the brakes down. So then we can come up, turn the pump back off once you've got your pressure and your brakes on. All right, keep them moving down here. Next thing that we're going to do here is step on down again to the ECAM pages. And first we're going to use the flight control. And there's all of our flight control surfaces here. You have the left aileron, right aileron. We have our left rudder pedals, left elevators, pitch trim, the leading edge slats, and flap settings and speed brakes. Okay. Now if we come on back here, what we're doing is just look to verify that the computer agrees. But we do want to make sure that the flap handle is in the forward position. Speed brakes are retracted and currently disarmed. Once that's done, we're going to step upstairs yet again. We're going to be back and forth for a little bit. Probe heat, we want to make sure that's set to the auto de-illuminated, so the state that it's currently in indicates auto. And while we're up here, we're going to go ahead and set the APU bleed now. All right. Now, we're ready to start getting into the rest of the cockpit configuration. This gets pretty quick here, which is fun. And once you get the flows down, it gets pretty easy. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that as long as refueling is complete, but we want to turn off any white lights. So we're just going to sort of work our way up here, going up. So there's crew oxygen supply. We're going to turn our fuel pumps on. Okay, and from this point, we just want to make sure we don't have any white lights. Now, what we're going to do next is check that the cross bleed is set to auto, and that's going to be right here. You can see it's currently in the auto position. Your zone temperatures, so here's our zones, and here's the temperature settings. So this is for your air conditioning, is going to be set as required. The electrical panel, so notice that we're once again going up. The electrical panel, you want to make sure that there aren't any faults except for Gen 1 and Gen 2 because the engines are off, which is why they're currently faulting. And then moving, we already set the fuel pumps a moment ago. We already did our APU test. So moving to the other side here, we want to make sure the big one here is that the ventilation system is that all lights are off. All right. Okay, now let's run through some ECAM checks. Let's see if I can get us into a better view here. So getting into the ECAM, it's a little hard, I know, because of the reflections, because those reflections are new. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to hold the recall. Now, I don't know if this functionality is actually modeled, but you would hold this for 3 seconds, and any previous or any errors that were recorded during the previous flight that were later cleared would then appear here, in the upper ECAM in that bottom left box there. Okay, so we checked that. Everything is good. Going over to our door page, we want to make sure that the pressurization is at least above 1500 psi. If it wasn't, then you would consult the maintenance and manufacturer's manual to verify that the pressurization was good enough for the flight that you were about to take. But obviously, I don't think this part is modeled in the aircraft, but it's fun to check. And then moving over to the hydraulics page, we want to make sure that all hydraulic levels are in the normal parameters. Now, if I'm not mistaken, that's what these 3 arrows here indicate. This one was a little hard to find, so if I'm off by this, guys, by all means, please correct me because I want to have everything as accurate as I can. But we want to make sure that hydraulic levels are in the green sectors, indicating that there's enough hydraulic fluid and pressure. And then moving over to the engine page, last thing we want to check is oil quantity. We want to make sure the oil quantity remains always above 9.5 quarts of oil and then 1 quart of oil per hour of flight needed. Okay, so 9.5 minimum and then 1 quart per every hour of flight time that you are expected to be in the air. Again, this is another one that I do not believe is modeled, so just enjoy the fact that you're walking through the process and pretend, right? That's what it's all about. And then now that completes the preliminary cockpit preparation. So now we're going to go into the cockpit preparation. All right. So as I said, with the preliminary cockpit preparation out of the way, let's go ahead and move into cockpit preparation. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to step back upstairs and we're going to turn the ground control on, and then we're going to do a CVR test. Now, I don't know if you guys can actually hear this. It's a very, very faint tone, but there is a tone that plays when we press the CVR test button. Let me turn the game sound up so hopefully you can hear it. Okay, so the tone did play. Like I said, I hope it comes across all right, but no promises. All right, and then be sure to turn the ground control back off after the tone is heard. Moving up the chain here to the evac, make sure that we set that to the captain's position. At this point, ADIRs 1, 2, and 3 come to the nav position. Moving down to the bottom here, we're going to set our external lights. Remember, continuing with the up arrows here, we sort of work up in a flow. So external lights, we want to make sure the wing lights are turned on. Wing lights aren't required, nav lights are. Okay. And then any other lights that are necessary, strobe light also goes to the auto position. If refueling is complete, which is why we set it to instant, and this was one of those delays I was talking about earlier, seatbelt signs do go to the on position, no smoking or portable devices go to the auto position, and the emergency exit light goes to the armed position. Moving up to the cabin pressure, you want to make sure it is in the auto position. Again, just like before, de-illuminated as you're currently seeing it is in the auto position. We do want to make sure that stays that way. Moving up to the pack flow here. If your passenger count is 141 passengers or less, we would set that to low. Anything above is norm. And for abnormal, hot, and humid conditions, we would then set it to high. On the electric page, moving down to the ECAM for a minute, talking about the electric panel, we would set the electric page here. And let's back up just a second. And we want to make sure that batteries 1 and 2 are below 60 amps and falling. The falling is normal. All right. Now we're going to step back upstairs once again. If you have central fuel tanks, now this isn't currently modeled as far as the mode select, but central fuel tanks, if they are empty, you would want to set these to off. Or if you have a center tank fault, that would appear here on the upper ECAM. If you see center tank fault, and I believe it's actually over here that displays, honestly, I can't remember, it's been a minute. But you would step upstairs to the overhead panel and turn your center tanks off. Okay. The mode select here, we would want them to be in the manual configuration. However, as you can see, that is not currently modeled. All right, and now we'll go up one more level to the engine fire test. Now, be very careful when doing this because I accidentally pulled the engine fire test as I was creating this guide. And so you want to be very careful. Just come over here and push the test button. Don't worry about trying to go for the guard. So there it goes. Now, while that's happening, holding it down, you can see that the engine fire checklist displays on the upper ECAM, and which is exactly what we're looking for. Repeat, rinse, and repeat for engine 2. And you can release now. All right, and then there is one more switch that's up here, or rotary, that we need to pay attention to. And it is this one here, the audio switching. We want to make sure that is in the norm position. And the third reception panel, it's not currently modeled, but if it was, you would configure that for the third seat and to record any of the cabin announcements. All right, and now we're going to go to the RMP, or radio management panel, which is down over here. There's your radio management panel. We want to make sure that the green nav light is off, the green select light is off, and then here you would tune your frequencies at this point, ATIS, ATC, etc. And at this point, we would contact ATC, get our clearance information. We're going to simulate that. We've gotten our clearance. We've been approved for our flight plan. And now we're going to come over here and set the transponder. We're going to hit clear twice to clear the entry, and then put in whatever transponder code you want and set the transponder to the auto position. All right, now at this point is when I would recommend starting your boarding procedure. Okay, and so how we're going to do that is by jumping into the MCDU, and then we'll get into the rest of the configuration. So stepping down to the MCDU, you can also adjust your brightness here as well if desired. Clear any messages that are currently on the scratch pad to get them out of your way. And to start your passenger count, you have a couple of different methods. We're going to go to ATSU, AOC, or Airline Operational Control, and we're going to go to Weights and Balances. Now in the Weights and Balances menu, here is where you would enter your passenger count for your flight, as well as any cargo that is in the cargo hold. Now let me show you what I mean, because there's a slight difference there. We're going to step over to our flight pad here, go to Operational Flight Plan, scroll up, and you know, if you're viewing this on a PDF from SimBrief, they're all in the same location. So keep going, and here we go. Passenger count, 148. Now, notice that cargo is empty, and it's because it automatically assumes some weight based on the passenger count. So for each passenger, I think it adds 150 pounds of cargo, if memory serves. Now, if you specifically had entered cargo, that would also be populated here in the extra weight. So what we're going to pay attention to for today is the 148 passenger count. Now, stepping back to the MCDU, if you had cargo in that cargo field, we would enter that here. But we're going to put 148 passengers on board, and we're just going to put that in here. Now that is the manual way to do this. Let me show you another way. Since we have SimBrief, and the SimBrief is connected to the aircraft, we can do OFP request and hit send. And notice it pulls everything as it did before. Okay? And then now you just hit start boarding. Now my boarding is set to instant. And then in a minute we'll hear a nice PA message as well.
From the flight deck, on behalf of myself, your captain, the first officer, and cabin crew, I'd like to take this time to welcome you aboard our flight. We're just wrapping up some paperwork up front here and waiting to receive final numbers from the ground crew, then we'll be on our way. Flight attendants will be coming through the cabin shortly with a very important safety briefing. We do ask that you give them your full, undivided attention as they review the safety operations of this Airbus aircraft. We do appreciate your business having you aboard this flight. If there's anything we do to make your flight any more enjoyable, please don't hesitate to ask. Welcome aboard.
That's right. Welcome aboard. All right, so the next step is the MCDU configuration. So the MCDU configuration, there's two different ways to do it. You have just like we did here with the OFP request, we can have a lot of the information pre-populated using the SimBrief integration. However, for the sake of this being a tutorial, I'm going to show you how to do it without it. We're going to do everything from scratch and walk through the various pages, okay? Okay, so we're first going to start by going to the MCDU menu to get back to the main menu. We're going to clear that. We're just going to go FMGC for Flight Management Computer. First, we start with the data page. Now, there is an acronym DIFSRIP is that pilots use to program the MCDU. First one is data. I is init or initialization. Then you have F for flight plan. R for Rad Nav or radio navigation. I for initialization page B, which later becomes fuel performance. And then finally P for performance, where we get our takeoff numbers, speeds, etc. So real quick overview. I'm not going to go into extreme detail. The guide absolutely does, breaks everything down. I also have an advanced MCDU guide on Patreon if you guys are interested in that, which goes way, way further into detail than myself or the guide will. So first, up here on the data page, you have the current engine information on the aircraft, the air rack cycle that's currently loaded into the database, any stored routes or waypoints or runways or nav aids. Change code, based on this number, will derate the performance of the engine. So it is a code that is put in to basically reduce wear and tear on the aircraft as it ages and gets more and more miles on it. All right, so from here, there's our data page. So now we're going to go to I init. So this is the initialization page where we're going to tell the aircraft where we are, what we're going, what altitude we're going to fly at, and the fuel burn that we want it to use. Now, fuel burn is sort of probably a wrong way for me to say what cost index is. Again, the guide goes into a bit further detail on that, but not much. The MCDU guide that I did, it goes into extreme detail on that. So, or you can just Google that, but it's way more complex than that. But basically, the higher the number, the more fuel will burn. Okay, and the faster we should travel, quote unquote. So from here, we could do an initialization request, and this will pull all this information directly from SimBrief. But as I said today, we're going to do everything by the book. Now, one thing that's really handy with the latest Flybywire development is that you can click on the screen and it enters the scratch pad or keyboard pad. So I can actually use my keyboard to type in here, or you can use the pad down here, however you want to do it. Now, what we're doing is we are going from KTUS to KLAX. And we're going to put that in the from to field. No company route. That's what it's asking here. We're just going to hit return. Alternate. We are going to K Ontario if we need to. Or KONT, not K Ontario. Flight number. We are American Airlines 4312 today. Just made one up. Cost index for this flight, according to the guide, is 60, and cruise altitude is 340. Just put that in here, and just click on the screen if you want to turn that off. But that's it for the initialization page. So now we're going to go to the flight plan page. Now, we're going to first start by setting up our departure and then the arrival. Now, let's go ahead and take a look over here for just a moment so I can show you guys where all the information resides. I want you guys to sort of keep this in the back of your minds here as we move through it. And then we'll walk through it again so you guys can see it again after we've entered it all. We are departing from Tucson, Arizona using runway 29 right. We are departing on the Wildcat 3 SID, standard instrument departure, using the Gila Bend transition. From the Gila Bend, we will be jumping onto the J104 airway. We will be exiting the 104 airway at Messi. From Messi, flying direct to Eastwood. From Eastwood, jumping onto the Hollywood 1 Star or standard terminal arrival route, landing at Los Angeles on runway 25 left. Okay, so keep that in mind here, and we're going to go ahead and come back to this. Actually, I have a neat idea that might help everybody. Hang on one second. This might be kind of cool. Hang on, I didn't think about that. Let's just grab this. And I can take a picture of that, put that up here like this, do this. It's going to be kind of fun. All right, Groovytons. And I think I can zoom in on this. Maybe not. All right, that'll work. And then finally, open up another window here. Okay. Now, it's still not going to be perfect, but hopefully it'll work out. All right, let's jump on down and get back to work here. So that should work here. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger where it's not intrusive. Try to put that down there for you guys. Okay. So I know it's still small, but it's what I got to work with. Anyway, so we are departing from Tucson. We are going to hit the departure menu here to center in our SID. First, we're telling it how we're leaving the airport. We're going out on 2908. Then we're telling it the Wildcat 3, the SID. And we're using the Gila Bend transition. And then we're just going to hit insert. So far, so good, right? Now, from Gila Bend, remember, we're jumping onto the J104 airway. So we're going to go ahead and enter that in now. And how we're doing that is, remember, Gila Bend is right before the J104, which means that's how we're getting onto the 104. So we're just going to select Gila Bend right here. So from Gila Bend, Airways. Airways will always go on the left, waypoints on the right. So J104, drop that in. And it does take a second. This is normal. There we go. And going to Messy. Okay, and then hit insert. And that part's done. Now, something I want you guys to pay attention to here on our route for a second is if you look at from Messy, we're going direct to Eastwood, but Eastwood is right before the Hollywood 1, meaning that Eastwood is our transition point onto the Hollywood 1. So instead of putting Eastwood in on the flight plan, we're actually going to do that when we enter in our star, and I'll show you what I mean here for those who haven't seen this before. So from here, we're going to select KLAX, and again, the arrival, standard terminal arrival route. Again, telling it what runway we're hoping to land on, ILS 25 left, and we're going to be using the Hollywood 1 to get into the airspace. Now, the next point is Sivu. Now, let me show you our guide here for a second, and it'll explain why we're using Sivu as our transition. What it's asking for here, via, means how am I getting onto the approach? Okay, not how am I getting onto the star. Notice the via is empty. So the cool thing about stars or approaches, read them backwards. You're taking the Hollywood 1 to the ILS 25 left, but how are you getting from the Hollywood 1 onto the 25 left approach? That's what the via is. That's what's asking here. And so if we go to our guide here for a minute, throw that back up. We're way ahead here, so let me scroll down a bit. There it is. You can see here, this is the Hollywood 1 approach chart, or star chart, excuse me. And we can see that right up here in the top right. Remember I said everything you need is in this guide. And the final point here is Sivu. That lets us know that Sivu is our final waypoint, or in this case a VOR looks like, before we jump onto the 25 left approach. Okay, so we're following that, which means we're going to select Sivu here. And then remember I was telling you about Eastwood. There's Eastwood right there, and that's how we're going to jump on to the Hollywood 1. And that's our transition point. I know it's kind of weird how it asks you backwards, but remember I said if you read it backwards, now it all makes sense again. Take a look at our flight plan that's on the screen. There's Eastwood, jumping onto the Hollywood 1, taking it to Sivu. From Sivu, we'll exit the Hollywood 1 and jump onto the ILS 25 left approach. And that's why we didn't enter the direct point from Messy to Eastwood. Okay, now if we had had more waypoints in between Eastwood and the Hollywood 1, we would have entered that in manually. Okay, so our next step here, we have our flight plan entered, but now we need to verify that there isn't anything wrong with it. So we're going to step up front. We're going to change our nav display from arc over to plan. I like to keep it at 10 miles, but you can extend this out a little bit maybe if you wanted to. But this is what we're looking for here. So actually, we'll leave it at 40. That still works out all right. And then what we're going to do is use the arrows. Oh, let me get that off the screen. There we go. We're going to use the arrows down here on the MCDU to step through the flight plan. And what we're looking for is any weird backtracks, any waypoints that don't belong there that just look really, really, really wrong based on where you're going, or discontinuities, which is a break in the flight plan or a gap. So far, everything's looking good. There's Messy, there's Eastwood, McQueen, Midler, Monroe, Hollywood. Bruin. Avatar, I think. Day. Wad up. Okay, so there we have a discontinuity. This is what the discontinuity looks like. Let's see if I can bring that down a little bit. There we go. Notice now we have a break in the flight plan. Okay, and if we look down at the MCDU, there's our discontinuity. Now, whenever you see a discontinuity like this, okay, you can do a couple of different things. You can check your flight plan. Okay, if you scroll all the way through, this is going to, oh, here we go. That'll make that much easier. Here's the detailed flight route. Okay, you should be able to see just about everything that's entered into the flight plan right here. So, for example, there's our direct Eastwood. Remember, we were seeing McQueen, Midler, etc. And what we're looking for is Cebu. So we know there isn't anything missing. We are going from Cebu to Los Angeles. So at this point, what we can do is step back down to the MCDU and simply clear the discontinuity. We're not missing any entries, and there isn't any vectors or anything that have to be entered. So we'll just clear that. And then if we take a look again at our nav display, whoa, sorry about that. You can see now the flight plan has connected. We can continue stepping through it to make sure it takes us all the way down to the approach. There's the initial fix for the approach. All the way down to the runway. We're good to go. So our flight plan is now complete. When the flight plan is complete and verified, you can set your nav display back to ARC or nav, depending on whichever your preference is, and then set your range, as desired. We'll be double checking this again later, though, so you don't have to do it right now. All right. So the next step here is, the next step here would be stepping over to the R in DiffScript, which is Rad Nav. Now, some departures do require a VOR to be used, or an ILS frequency that you may enter in. 29er right doesn't use one for the departure, so we're not going to worry about that. Many times, if it is required, I have found for Flybywire at least, in the A320, it will actually auto-populate here. But for today's flight, it's not necessary. Which brings us over to the initialization page again. Only this time, we're going to take a step to the right and go to the initialization page B. Zero fuel weight, center of gravity. We're just going to click that. It'll auto-calculate here. Now, this is our passenger load, and this is after we have fueled. Okay, so we're going to enter that in. There it is. Block fuel, you can either take it from our flight plan. Remember, we did 13,910 pounds of fuel, which would translate to 13.9, or you can get it from the lower or the upper ECAM. It's at the bottom of it here. So if we look up, there's our fuel right there, or 920 it looks like, but that's all right. 13.9 is all we're putting in here for now. Now, we also have final time, final reserves, and alternate. Now, if we come over to our SimBrief flight plan again, let's go back up to the fuel section. There we go. You have final reserves, 3.4, and alternate 2.0. So let's go ahead and enter that in, 3.4 and 2.0. So 3.4 for final time, and alternate 2.0. Which gives about 23 minutes to our alternate fuel and final reserves of almost an hour. Okay. And that is it for the initialization fuel prediction page. As you can see, once we calculated it, it changed from initialization page B to fuel prediction. Now, we also do want to take note of this right here, which is our takeoff weight. We're going to need that. Which brings us now over to performance. So in the performance page, first thing that we're going to do is we're going to be taking off with flaps 1. All right, our flex attempt we're going to get in just a second. Transition altitude 18,000 feet, always in the United States. Thrust reduction acceleration altitude. This is the point above or after takeoff at which the aircraft will slowly pitch down, reduce the engines from takeoff to the, whether it be flex or toga, but down into the climb position, and then accelerate and to its climb speed. Engine out acceleration, this is again the same thing. The altitude after takeoff at which the aircraft will pitch down, accelerate, and continue the climb. And I think both of these actually can be adjusted in the EFB. So let's talk about the flex attempt, because that's going to be the next thing that we're going to need here today. Okay, so next we're going to use our takeoff performance calculator here. Now this is going to be slightly off because it is for CFM engines and not for the Neo engines. But it's close enough where we can still have some fun with it. And I'm actually testing out a different calculator that I found on FlightSim.2 that we may be adding to that instead. So we might do some modifications here. But airport is going to be KTUS. We're departing. Excuse me. Departure runway is going to be 29 right. Not left. That would be bad. That's a tiny runway. Outside air temperature, we should get it here. But maybe not. So in our case, we'll go to our MEDAR information. And we can get that right here from the clipboard. Go to our main page, excuse me. And 32 degrees outside. Wow, that's a hot day. Well, it actually is kind of warm outside, truth be told. So we're going to come back up here and type 32. Takeoff weight. Now, unfortunately, it does want kilograms. So let's go ahead and solve that problem. So what I do here is I just Google pounds to kilograms, brings up a cool calculator. Remember, we were 140,000. So I'm just going to put 140,100 is 140.1. So 63,548. Now it's going to want this entire number here. So you can just the 63,548. So we switch back over. 63,548. Packs on, that's your air conditioning. Flaps configuration is going to be 1. Hit calculate. And we're going to notice, pay attention to the V speeds because they're going to be slightly different, but they will definitely be close enough. And we're going to be using a flex to temp of 43. So, going back down here, going back to our MCDU, and everything we just did is also in the guide. 43 for our flex temp. Flex to temp, what that is instead of using maximum power or toga, you will actually reduce, there's a throttle position, if we back up, right here that says flex. So instead of using toga, which is running the engines to their maximum thrust capability for takeoff, we'll instead use the flex, which saves on engine wear and tear, fuel, all that good jazz. All right, so that's all that is. And this tells the computer how to do that. After that's done, we'll calculate our V speeds. So simply just give it a click and click it again to enter it. Excellent. And so, for example, the calculator had 129, 134, and 137. We're running 128, 129, 133. So again, slight difference, but the flex temp should still be close enough. All right. And that is going to complete our MCDU configuration. So now we'll complete the rest of the cockpit preparation, and we're going to take the aircraft right up into the point where it's ready to call for pushback. All right, so to complete the cockpit preparation, we are now going to move to the FCU. We're going to set our altimeter today, which as we discovered was 29er. Make sure that the flight directors are on. Make sure you set your nav display range as desired, necessary. Any ADF or VOR navigation that's required, you would set that at that time too. You want to make sure this speed box is hashed. Your final runway heading for takeoff, in our case, is going to be 303 degrees. The reason why it's not 29er or 290 or anything of that nature is because we already have a runway 03. So instead they changed it to runway 29er. So runway 03. Set your initial clearance altitude. You would get this from air traffic control or your departure chart. In our case, we're just going to simulate that we've been giving initial clearance for 12,000 feet. Let's move on down a bit. You want to make sure that your standby instruments are set to match the rest of the aircraft. So set our barometric pressure to 9er. Make sure that there isn't a variance above 20 feet. In this case, they're dead on the money. And then finally, stepping over to the far right next to the auto brakes, make sure that your anti-skid and nose wheel steering are turned on. All right, and so now let's move back to the rest of the cockpit check. Weather radar needs to make sure it's in the off position. The gain knob would be set to the CAL. There's a button right about there. There's a setting that says CAL. Predictive wind shear, make sure it remains off. Moving up to our ECAM display again. Let me see if I can get you a little bit better view here. Go to the status page, make sure it says normal. There would normally be quite a bit more information populated here, but I don't think it's modeled yet is the issue here. Go to the pressurization, make sure that landing elevation is referencing the auto position as we discussed earlier. Once again, repeating a couple of checks, double checks, safety checks, all that good jazz. Make sure engine master mode switches are both set to the off position. Make sure that the ignition mode is set to the norm position. And make sure that our parking brake is set. Step upstairs here. Turn our beacon light to the on position.
Flight attendants, arm doors, and cross-check.
And when the light's turned on, you are now ready for pushback and engine start. This is the point. These were all the changes that have currently been put into the guide at this time. I hope you guys have enjoyed this little tutorial. Real world pilots, if you happen to see this, let me know how I did. All of this information was taken from the real world Airbus A320 Standard Operating Procedures Guide. It is also important to take note, guys, that a lot of these... Oh, she's talking. A lot of these procedures will vary based from company to company. There will be some deviations. And when I say company to company, American Airlines versus Delta, versus anyone else who uses the Airbus aircraft. So some of them may not be dead on. Again, please keep in mind that there were a few steps for the sake of tutorial purposes and simulation that I removed because I didn't feel they were quite necessary and needed for the flow to enjoy the simulation experience. Anyway, let me know what you guys think of this down below. If you guys are interested in supporting me or supporting the channel, please consider joining on Patreon. We have access to all of my guides. We have many more changes coming. We have quite a few more changes still coming for the Airbus, for the taxi, takeoff, and landing procedures, as well as some new charts and performance information coming to the TBM 930 guide. And then we have currently a CRJ guide in the works. It's in its infancy, but it has started. So stay tuned for that, guys. As always, stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.